Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Swanek. I am the Northeast Program Manager with the Forest Stewards Guild and the manager of the Sustaining Ash Partners Network. We are really excited to have you here, and I want to welcome you to the second event in our series, The Pathways to Sustain Ash. This webinar is on the how-to of ash seed preservation. This is part of a three-part series exploring ash seed collection from sourcing, collection, to propagation. We're going to drop some links in the chat for those of you that might be interested in some of the previous events and our upcoming event. So we had our first event was another webinar where we discussed the value of preserving ash seed. So you can check out the recording. And we also have an event coming up in 2 weeks. It's the final event in the series. It's going to be an in-person field tour of the New Hampshire State Nursery on March 20th to learn about the nursery's efforts to grow ash and manage EAB in the state. It's fully booked right now, but if you're interested in going, I highly encourage folks to get on the wait list. Spots have been opening up. So go ahead and sign up if you're interested. Before we jump into the webinar, I want to share a land acknowledgement, and I also want to share some background on the Sustaining Ash Partners Network. The lands at the core of our network and that many of us presently inhabit here in the Northeast sit on the ancestral homelands and waterways of the region's indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that these peoples have been stewards of these lands since time immemorial and are grateful for their continued stewardship and care for this place. For our region's tribal nations, issues of sovereignty, territorial rights, and access to sacred sites are ongoing. We acknowledge their inherent rights to sovereignty and recognize the painful impacts of settler colonialism that attempted to remove them from their homelands and erase their cultures. SAP-Ne is committed to building cross-cultural connections that celebrate the vibrancy, knowledge, and adaptability of our region's tribal nations. So what is SAP-Ne, the Sustaining Ash Partners Network? So we're a regional network led by the Guild and our partners who work across state agencies, federal agencies, tribal nations, NGOs, universities, all across the Northeast. I've listed some partners here, but we have a full list on our website. And we were founded in response to the impacts of emerald ash borer, which threatens to eliminate ash from the landscape. Our efforts at SAP-Ne focus on both the culturally important brown or black ash, as well as other ash species throughout the region. SAP-Ne aims to support collaborative stewardship by building off of ongoing work that's already happening and trying to develop cross-boundary partnerships across the region to sustain ash on the landscape. Our primary objectives are to encourage stewardship approaches that honor and amplify the cultural values of ash, to offer workshops and webinars like the one that you're attending here today, to establish a network of demonstration areas that highlight ash stewardship across the region, and to develop a web hub to share resources on ash. Our goal is to support a community of partners across the region, and we are happy that you're all here to be part of our community. If you want to find out more about the network, you can check out our website, and you can also contact me. So before we get going, I'm going to share some kind of ground rules on the webinar. We are going to share a poll with you all. As part of our funding sources, it's important that we track participant time. So hopefully this should take you not too long when we get the poll up. And while that's getting put up, I'm going to share some ground rules for the webinar. So the webinar is going to last for around 90 minutes. We ask that you please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you're called on to ask a question. The webinar is going to be broken up into 3 parts. Our first talk will feature 2 speakers who are going to share their insights on ash seed collection and scouting. Our speakers are Tyler Everett, PhD candidate and member of the Micmac Nation, and Ella McDonald, master's student. Both of our speakers are from the University of Maine's Ash Protection Collaboration Across Wabankik. There will be time for Q&A after their talk. During the Q&A sessions, we ask that you use the raise hand function. You can find that down in the React section of the panel, or you can put your questions into the chat. We're then going to have more talks that are going to explore processing, storing, and propagating of ash seed. Our speakers are Benedict, Assistant Director of the Environment Division and longtime leader in ash preservation from the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, and Emily Baisden, Seed Center Director from the Wild Seed Project. There will be time for Q&A after these talks as well. And then after our 2 rounds of talks, we're going to transition into breakout groups where you'll have the opportunity to be guided by our speakers and experts in the field to walk through your own ash seed collection planning cycle. to give you some kind of hands-on experience with how you might bring seed collection back into your communities. And then we'll regroup after the breakouts for just quick shares and closing out of the webinar. I'll give everyone another few seconds to fill out the poll. It's okay if you don't get to it. We'll just try and get the majority of people in the poll. All right, I'm going to end the poll. And I'm going to hand it over to Ella and Tyler to get us started. Thank you both.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. I'm just getting our presentation pulled up. Can you guys all see that?
Looks good.
Looks good.
Okay, great. I'm Ella McDonald. I'm a master's student in the Ash Protection Across Wabankik lab, working closely with Tyler to put together some guidance for seed collection, especially brown ash seed collection. Tyler, do you want to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure, thanks, Ella. Gwe Wabanoke Weig, Migma Talawisi Tyler Everett. Hello, I'm a person of Dawn. I'm Migma, and my name is Tyler Everett. I'm a PhD candidate in the APCAW lab, and I'm happy to see so many people on the call today.
Great. So if you're interested in ash seed collection, a great place to start is the Ash Seed Collection Manual. It's actually the Brown Ash Seed Collection Manual, which was put together by a former student in the APCAW lab, Emily Francis, who I believe is on the call today. So shout out to Emily. And she put together this step-by-step, super accessible guide for how to do ash seed collection in the Northeast, but specifically in Maine. And it walks you through how to identify sites, how to identify trees, how to prepare data sheets and materials for collection, and then actually how to do the collection. So everything you need is right in that document, and it's stored on our UMaine website. So ash seed collection planning is a multiple year process. As we know, ash trees are seed periodically. So brown ash seeds usually every 8 years, but sometimes we see it seeding more frequently than that. Green ash typically seeds every year, and white ash seeds every 2 to 3 years. And so the winter time, January through March, about this time, is a great time to think about whether seed collection will be possible this year based on previous years, and also to evaluate your protocol from previous years and to stock up on materials. In April and May, that's an awesome time to start scouting for sites. So even though it's wet out there, you can go out and look for flowering on trees if you have binoculars. You can sex the trees and look for EAB activity, and then mark potential trees for potential seed trees if they are female. In the summertime, there's not a ton to do. You can collect a leaf collection, so a foliage sample, which is outlined in the manual. And you can also monitor seed growth and development. But September is really going to be that time in the Northeast where you're getting out and collecting seed on the ground. And then after that, you're quickly going to be drying the seed, processing it, and sending it into storage. And then after that, you kind of want to take inventory of your collections and plan for the next year. So this is sort of a yearly guide of what you're thinking about when you're thinking about ash seed collection. And so the actual steps to seed collection are first to ID sites with ash trees, determine the species that are present and the sex of the ash trees present. And then you want to prepare for collection, and this takes longer than you would expect. So you're going to want to gather materials, organize helpers, and also get together data sheets. You really want to decide where you're going to send seed before you go out so that you know what data is appropriate to collect. And then you're going to collect seed, and I know Les and Emily after us are going to talk about preparing for storage and processing seed. So finding ash seed collection sites, we highly recommend that you consider the habitat characteristics of the 3 different kinds of ash and the kind of ash that you want to collect. Brown ash likes to keep its feet wet, so it grows in areas that have standing water for part of the year. If you're looking for brown ash, I would recommend looking along streams or in wetlands. Green and white ash grow in more upland soils. Green is still sometimes down in more riparian areas. But we're really not that interested in seed collection from street trees. Usually those are nursery stock trees, and it's more important for genetic conservation to collect from wild trees. You also want to consider whether emerald ash borer is present. Areas where emerald ash borer is present are should be more prioritized to collect from because we're not going to have access to that genetic stock for much longer before EAB kills the trees. You want to consider whether collectors have permission to collect on the site, so get in touch with the land steward or the owner and see if you can get access for seed collection. And then one thing you really want to think about is whether it's actually physically possible to get to the site. So usually we're choosing sites that are pretty close to the road because you have to bring in things like pole pruners or a big shot. You're going to have a heavy backpack with you probably. So usually you want to make sure that the site is accessible. Another thing to think about with black or brown ash is bringing muck boots because there is typically a lot of standing water in those sites. And then lastly, Les always brings up whether the trees are high quality. So this can look like being basket quality trees. It can also look like a tree surviving longer in a stand that has EAB present. We're really interested in doing seed collection from those trees in particular. So another way that you can find sites is by considering maps. So APCAW recently made this map that shows areas that have had seed collections done in the past. So this shows from the 2024 season where seed collections were done and how many mother trees were collected from. We looked at the National Tree Seed Center's guidance for how much seed should be collected from every level for ecoregion and landed on our goal being collection from 15 mother trees per each level for ecoregion and at least 1,000 viable seeds from each mother tree in that region. And as you can see, there's still a lot of gaps in the areas that are red and orange where we haven't met that goal. So sending people to those areas is super important, and we hope that this is a region-wide map in the future. Also, as I mentioned before, collecting from areas with EAB is similarly very important. This just calls out the towns where we had seed collection done in 2024. The darker the green, the more mother trees were collected from. And then the purple triangles call out where our partners or tribal nations have seed collection kits where folks can check those kits out, and in them they contain all the materials for doing seed collection as well as a seed collection manual. So in the future, you'll be able to scroll over this map and see people's contact information for who to get in contact with to check out a kit for a few days. And now I'll turn it to Tyler to talk about some ASH ID.
Thanks, Ella. So like Ella pointed out, as you're trying to plan for your upcoming seed collection, you need to know where these ash stands are, and the first step is to know what to look for an ash tree. So we have 3 ash species in Maine. We have brown or black ash, which we're most interested in for seed collection through APCAW. Then there's also green and white ash. One of the big characteristics that we key in on is the branching pattern. Branching patterns for ash trees is opposite, meaning that directly opposite from one branch is another branch across the main stem. And that's different than an alternate branching tree, where the tree branches alternate along the stem. We also look at the site that the tree is growing in. Ella mentioned brown ash liking its feet wet. These are floodplains, depressional wetlands, river terraces. Green ash is a little bit more upland in some of the swales, but still intermixed in brown ash dominated areas. And then white ash is more of an upland species, oftentimes a super canopy species on the landscape. Then we also key in on the bark. The bark of brown ash is really unique, corky feeling, whereas green and white ash have some similarities in terms of these deep fissures that kind of have a diamond-like shape. And so we key in on the bark. We also look at the twigs. And for the terminal buds, brown ash is a really large Hershey Kiss-esque terminal bud. And so we also key in on the axillary buds, which are those smaller buds on the sides of the branches. The reason we key in on those is one, it does carry that same Hershey Kiss color for brown ash, but it also creates a notch in the leaf scar. And so depending on the notch, you can distinguish the three species. For brown ash, it's almost a lack of a notch. Sometimes there's even a space between the leaf scar and the axillary bud. Um, and then for green ash, it's a shallow notch. And then for white ash, and this example is not a great one, but it's a deeply notched leaf scar. We also look at that leaf scar, and in particular the bundle scars where the veins connect to the leaf. For brown ash, it's almost like a full circle or a horseshoe. And then for green ash, it's more of a U shape. And then for white ash, it's a crescent shape. And that's because of the notching from the axillary bud. We also key in on the leaf, which the leaves for ash trees are compound. And in particular for brown ash, we look at the leaflets. The leaflets that come off of the midrib of the compound leaf for brown ash have no micropetiole or a small space in between the leaflet and the midrib, which differs from green ash and white ash. Green ash and brown ash both have yellow foliage in the fall, whereas white ash can have this purplish violet hue to the foliage in the fall, or sometimes it's a true like dark violet color. And then lastly, we also look at the seeds, if we can collect the seeds. For green ash, the fruit body itself, that little like the actual fruit at the bottom of the samara, is like cigar shaped. And then for white ash and brown ash, they're a little bit closer looking in terms of the overall shape of the samara. But the fruit body on white ash has a really sharp contrast between where the fruit body is and where the blade of the samara starts. Whereas brown ash is this kind of tapered look between the two. And it also, brown ash looks like the blade of a canoe paddle, which is a really easy one to remember. Next slide. And then for seed collection, it's really key to look at flowering production or flower production. Ash trees are polygamodioecious, so you might see some male individuals with male flowers, female individuals with female flowers, or polygamous individuals with flowers that show characteristics of both male and female. For female flowers, they're these longer stems with these small dainty flowers at the end that have a wispy-like look, whereas male flowers, which is image B here, are globular in shape. They also often get attacked by this gall mite that make these large black growths on the male flowers, which will often stay on over the growing season, so you can characterize male or female even in the off season. If the seeds get fertilized by male pollen, the female flowers, those small dainty flowers develop into a seed samara, and then across all those stems, you get this cluster of seeds. Next slide. Like this image here. So you get this cluster of samaras, and that's what we're interested in collecting. Next slide.
Great.
Well, this is
I'll
Ella.
just talk really quick about where to send seeds. So I'm not going to go into too much detail because I know we're running out of time, but there are multiple different options for where to send the seed. You can send it to University of Maine, where we have one small fridge where we're storing seed for tribal nations and other research going on at UMaine. You could send it to the USDA ARS facility in Iowa, the USDA ARS facility in Colorado, Fort Collins, called the Black Box. And you can look at all the different requirements and criteria for these different facilities in our ash seed collection manual. But the most important piece is that you really, before seed collecting, you want to make sure that you have the right data sheets. So this data sheet is the National Seed Laboratory data sheet. It's for a single tree. It's accepted at UMaine or Fort Collins. You can find it in the seed collection manual or on our APCAW website. And this is the National Plant Germplasm Facility data sheet. You can take data from multiple trees in the same data sheet here, and it's required for Ames, Iowa. But you can also submit it to Fort Collins or to UMaine. And I wish I had more time to go into detail, but I'll just pass it back to Tyler to keep talking about materials for seed collection.
Yeah, so Emily Francis also pulled together with help from Benedict of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, this materials list of all the things you might need for collecting brown ash seed. Some of the ones that are really key and might cause you to wonder why we need that. A GPS, if you're filling out that data sheet, you need to put the coordinates of where you collected from. Binoculars, Ella pointed out, looking for female flowers can be really hard, and seeds in the canopy, especially at certain times. So binoculars give you a closer look. If you have permission from the landowner and you can mark these trees more permanently because flagging falls off a lot, you can do aluminum tags and you put that on the root flare at the base of the tree using a roofing nail. And you might need to drive that into the tree. So we also have a hatchet, which can also be used to clear brush. Then the pruning pole, that's really key. Pruning pole, a lot of people have them, but they can only reach so high. In this kit that is put together, the poles protect you if you were near power lines. You shouldn't collect near power lines, but if you were, they don't conduct electricity. And they can be added many extensions on one another to get to the really high trees. And then, of course, the cutting head portion of that pole pruner. The tarp to catch the seeds and cut branches, and then a rope. We have paracord in here, but I'm going to talk about poly rope as being one that doesn't stretch, and that can be helpful in certain situations. And then loppers help clear vegetation at the base of a tree where you're collecting. Next slide. I know we're getting really close on time, so I'm just going to go through this really quickly. In the seed collection process, the most common method that APCAW uses is the pole pruner method, where we identify some trees with that are producing seed, and the branches that are optimal are the ones producing the most seed. But you're also not going to disrupt the canopy of the tree too much by harvesting the branch. And you usually use a pole pruner. It's got two cutting options, usually a lopper head that's actuated by a rope, which is helpful if it doesn't stretch. And then also a saw to cut larger limbs. Before you start cutting branches, though, one, you don't want to be underneath that branch, but you also want to clear that area using the loppers, lay out a tarp. And the idea there is that that branch falls on the tarp, and then you don't lose seed when it hits the ground. This is a pocket chainsaw. So another technique is to take this pocket chainsaw, run it back and forth across the limb, and it will cut that branch. Obviously, that's really small. So how do you get that 60 feet up? Next slide. Oh, next slide again. The big shot. So this is just a giant catapult or slingshot that can throw a throw weight and a poly rope up over the branch. And then you would connect that pocket chainsaw, attach another length of rope, and then hoist it up to where you want to cut that branch, run it back and forth, and then harvest the branch. It's a lot to do, and sometimes you can skip some steps by just throwing the line over. And next slide will be the throw line. This is what a throw line looks like. So you throw this with the big shot, and if you don't want to use the pocket chainsaw, which is another technique that APCAW uses more commonly than the pocket chainsaw, just grab both ends of that poly rope and you shake vigorously until it dislodges some of the produced seed, and then hopefully it lands on the tarp you've laid out, or the branch comes loose and then you can pick it off of the branch. That's ideal, is when you're really lucky and you find a tree where you can just pick the seed by hand. If it's low-hanging fruit, literally, then you can just throw that in your paper bag and be on your way. You don't have to cut any branches. Next slide. Well, Ali, thanks for letting us talk. Sorry we went over a little.
That was great. Thank you so much, Tyler and Ella. We've got a couple minutes for questions. So if folks want to put questions in the chat or raise their hand, unmute. I'll get
I
us
have a
started.
question.
Yeah.
1,000 seeds to somebody who's never collected seeds before sounds like a lot. I guess I wonder, how do I know a tree is okay with me collecting 1,000 seeds from it?
Yeah, we actually just got back from native seed conference, and a lot of folks asked similar questions about the plants they were working with. And a good rule of thumb is to only take a third of what's being produced. And sometimes that hits your seed count quota that you're looking for, and sometimes it doesn't, but some seeds better than none. So yeah.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Tyler. And if you do end up collecting less than 1,000 seeds per tree, you can send your smaller collections either to UMaine to store them or to Fort Collins, but the facility in Iowa won't accept less than 1,000 per tree.
Thanks. A couple questions in the chat about are the seeds still viable if they are collected from the ground and if they've browned up potentially a little bit?
Yeah, it's not recommended that you collect from the ground. Sometimes they just land on the ground and you get to them in time that they're still viable. But just out of good practice, try to collect from the canopy. If you drop the seeds off your tarp, eventually you'll end up collecting some from the ground. And hopefully you don't have any that are not viable or have fungal decay or weevils that could infest some of the other seed.
Thank you. There's a few more questions. Maybe Ella and Tyler can answer them in the chat. I think we're going to move on to our next speaker.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Wild Seed Project with the ash work. So Wild Seed Project, for those who don't know, we're a nonprofit focused on bringing native plants back to the Northeast landscape. So we work with a lot of different species. And I'm Emily Baisden. I'm the seed center director. So I'm in charge of all the incoming seed, outgoing seed, the propagation efforts at our seed center, and a bunch of our educational stuff. We'll go. All right. So for seed intake, we work with over 100 different species on any given year, and most of our seeds come from trained volunteer or staff. We're working on trying to have a more robust volunteer group, so keep it tuned for that. But generally our species come in paper bags to dry, and then they dry on our wire shelves, where we monitor the temperature and the humidity of the room to make sure things don't get moldy. We try to have people collect when it's not wet out, so they come in already a little bit dry, but if we find we have extra wet seed, we'll lay them out on trays and use silica gel or something like that to just dry them further and make sure they're not going to mold in storage. In 2024, we didn't actually get any brown ash seed in. We got a little bit of green ash. And each bag comes in with forms that we have where folks are supposed to put in all the information about the seeds they collected. And then we go to process them from there. And I'm excited to hopefully offer more space in our refrigerators. We're always busting at the seams, but yeah, I'm hoping to offer some space for folks collecting ash seeds specifically for that. And I'll talk in a minute a little bit about how the ash seed that we work with is a little bit different from all of the other species that we're working on. So that gets me to processing. We clean all of our seeds here at the office for the most part. Some of them are cleaned at our seed center. They're checked for viability, so we remove branches and leaves and stems and stuff like that. We usually have them in trays or bowls. And we kind of check them to see if there's bug damage or mold or things like that. And anything that doesn't seem like it would survive or would be viable to grow, we throw outside. We don't tend to check for the embryo, and that's mostly because we're really storing them for shorter term use. We're mostly growing them and not sending them off to places like Colorado, if we were going to be doing that, we'd follow their more strict protocols. But we do kind of a basic cleaning process, and then make sure they're dry. And then they get stored in the refrigerator. So all of our seeds get stored in the refrigerator, in glass jars or paper envelopes, in Ziploc bags. That's just to keep out, refrigeration, moisture, and things like that. And we can monitor the temperature and the humidity. Each of our jars are labeled with as much information as we can put on them. For our regular seeds for seed sale, we have a lot number that we can find the code and find out where all the seeds were collected from, when, and any other information about them. So if it's a new wild collected spot, or if it's being saved for something specific and not for use for the seed sale, we write all of that on there. And then all the information for the date and the ownership location, stuff like that. For our brown ash, the seed is given, it's usually given to us from outside partners like APCAW. And they're a little bit different from our other seeds. Our other seeds are considered owned by us. With these seeds, they're considered owned by whatever the party that gave them to us were. And then that's stored, and they tell us to make final decisions on them. And then all of the important info goes on those jars. So for example, we had somebody reach out to us this past fall looking to do some seed sowing with some students. So we reached out to APCAW to see if it was cool to give them some seed, and they said yes, and we were able to provide that seed for that educational growing effort, which was nice to be able to do. So that gets me to kind of the last stage of what we're working on, is the propagation. And I'll say right off the bat, I've learned a lot, and I'm trying some new things in the future. I'll get to that in a minute. But the seed we got in I guess now almost 3 years ago, from APCAW, when we first tried it out with everybody, we planted them just in large pots to try our wild seed project backyard growing method, which just involves putting soil and seeds and sand into a pot and putting it in kind of the conditions that it would grow in the wild, and let it wait. Now ash seed takes a couple years to germinate that way. So we planted them in the pots, and I want to note, we didn't sort any of our seeds before that. We didn't do any checks for viability. We just put a bunch of seed in a pot and said, we'll see what happens in 2 years. And then it's really important to note that you really do have to protect them with wire mesh, because there's a lot of creatures that like to eat seeds. So then we waited 2 years for germination. And on the second year, we did get some germination. We pricked those plants out and potted them up. I'll say we had pretty low germination success. I think some of it was that we were maybe a little bit too heavy-handed with the sand that year. These seeds do like light to germinate, so there's potentially just not enough light. But then also, like I said, we didn't check any of the viability beforehand, so there's a good chance we just put a bunch of seeds that had weevils and things like that in them right into the pot. So you live and you learn. But we did get some baby trees, and that was exciting, just to, 2 years later, see some life come out of those pots. So that kind of brings me to the end. We've learned, I think, a lot, and I think we'll continue learning. I'd really like to try some different growing methods. I'm hoping this next year to try some of Les's protocols. We'll definitely, as you heard, we're now sorting our seeds, so we're making sure that there's more chance of viability going into those pots. But we really want to hone in some of our pot growing methods. So the backyard growing method, figuring out how much sand is exactly the right amount of sand, and seeing how long they can go into pots. I'm hoping at some point at the Seed Center in Cape Elizabeth to be able to plant some young trees in the ground for future use as well. So that brings me to the end. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Emily. Can you see that? That get us to the third slide.
All right. Yeah, we're at the locator. just sharing with everyone where we are located. It's the purple thumbtack push pin at the top of the screen. We're in extreme northern New York. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to overview the major points relating to seed collection success. They're based on some assumptions. Well, the assumption is that you've already targeted your seed source and worked through all of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the main seed characteristics that help determine the outcome. Talk about some of the external factors that determines the outcomes as well, and talk about the end products, determining the level of processing that you would need. And I'll provide some key reference material at the end of the presentation for you. Next slide, please. As you heard earlier, tip number 1 is to collect from quality trees. And I discourage the use of plastic bags. They lack circulation and should not be used. Used paper or sack cloths. Store in a dry and cool and well ventilated area, and process these seeds as soon as you possibly can to inhibit mold and mildew formation. And remember that these trees are actually embryos for future trees. They need to be treated gently to avoid damage, and dry them properly. And there's different stages of drying. Next slide, please. So tip number 1, quality is key from the very start to the very finish. Think about where you're collecting from and the type of trees that you're selecting from. You want to make sure they're not diseased, and you want to make sure that they're healthy trees and that they're representative of trees that you would want to see growing in the future. Next slide, please. Tip number 2, which I think is very important, is to consider your objectives. If you're going to be planting immediately and doing some propagation, then you'll have to stratify the seeds once they're cleaned. Figure out whether or not your objectives are short term, say 60 to 30 months. Freezers are most likely not needed. And long term, you're going to have some freezer capacity, whether that's on site or through some sort of a seed bank. And definitely for long-term cryogenic storage, outsourcing is likely needed because you may not have the capacity to do that. Next slide, please. So here's a flow chart I put together to outline tip number 2, starting from the seed collection and understanding what your objectives, and they are different. The terminal objectives is different. For instance, cryogenic storage is much different than processing seedlings. So there are a couple extra steps within the process. So if you're looking at long-term storage, you still need to air dry them, you need to clean them, and then you're going to have to test them, and you're going to have these seeds desiccated even further, dried down to less than 10%. If you're looking at immediate propagation or maybe short-term propagation, maybe you could hold them over for another year. I don't recommend it. I think you should probably try to either get them in cold storage or get them processed as soon as possible. And then you still have to dry them, you still have to clean them and stratify them would be the next step, and then put them into seed beds, pots. Next slide, please. Okay, so understand the external factors. Seed viability can decline significantly with age, but not necessarily the germination rate. Older seeds will still sprout, but they might not have the vigor. Cryopreservation for long-term storage might be needed to prevent germination and degradation. So something to think about. Next slide, please. Here's a chart that just kind of loosely demonstrates what I'm trying to explain about tip number 3 is that your seed viability will decline not only with age, but also with moisture content. So it's very important for you to dry these seeds down before storing them. Next slide, please. Here's another chart that provides another example, an explanation of the relative humidity and the number of years you can expect to store these seeds based on the percent moisture in the seeds. So it just reinforces the fact that it's really important to get your seeds dried down properly. The next slide, please. Understand the seed characteristics or different classifications of seeds, primarily orthodox seeds and recalcitrant seeds. Ash fall into the orthodox seed classification, and it really relates to how the seeds are structured and how they're able to function physiologically. When you think about the recalcitrant trees, you're talking more like some of the nut trees with a lot of fats and oils in them. So, but our primary focus is orthodox seeds for ash trees. Next slide, please. Tip number 5, as I mentioned before, you need to dry the seeds down. True orthodox seeds, as I mentioned, do very well in sub-freezing temperatures, but you need to get that moisture down. We all know that water expands when it freezes and can disrupt the cells and any type and organisms. So you want to make sure you get that moisture down. You can follow these steps for drying things down. Maintain a constant temperature of 38 to 40 degrees. Maintain relative humidity of 30 to 35%, and air dry 1 to 3 days before storing or planting the seeds. So you can go from a very expensive hygrometer that's probably cost a couple $100 to maybe something that costs maybe $40, $50. It's more of an analog type hygrometer. Next slide, please. Drying seeds, if you're going to be drying things down even further, you can invest in a little bit more and buy some desiccators and some drying agents like silica gel. Long-term storage, as I mentioned, requires special handling with specialized equipment. You should really understand, as I said at the very beginning, what your objectives are in terms of what it is you want to do with the seeds. Next slide, please. Earlier on, it was mentioned also when you're doing the collection is to document your efforts. That way you have references not only for the future, but you have an understanding of where your seeds came from. Maybe if you want to revisit that site, or if you want to replicate something from that particular tree stand. And also the last point on that is to combine your target tree and seed collection records together. So you've collected your seeds, you have information about your trees, and then you have your seed lots. You can combine those into one record. Next slide, please. Low-tech equipment and tools. This is the way to go if you don't have a lot of funds. The diagram on the far left is basically just a plywood box with a fan constructed into it, and they're using these 55-gallon drum paint strainers that are stacked on one another and just creating some airflow. This is from Bonner and Carfelt. Next slide, please. This is something that I actually constructed. Originally, it was made from a plywood box, but got the idea and inspiration when I was at the event last year. And you can buy a plastic bin at Walmart or Home Depot and cut it out and buy these 1 gallon or 5 gallon paint bucket strainers, and you can stack those into the hole that was cut on top of this bin. And you can buy one of these air movers that are available at Walmart or at Home Depot for drying basements that might have flooded. And all this stores into one handy container. It's lightweight and fairly cheap to construct. Next slide, please. So here's everything assembled and ready to go for drying seeds. Next slide, please. Of course, you can make some other types of containers and bins. This is just probably a couple 1x6s or 1x4s and some mesh that you can use for just stacking the seeds on one another. And if you want to put some sort of a fan on there, this is more of a passive way to dry seeds, but it's pretty effective. Next slide, please. If you want to get into sorting seeds, there's a lot of information online. Carfelt has some information as well. You can make these seed cleaners, basically use a system of vacuum and gravity to separate the bad seeds, which are more lightweight, and to collect the heavy seeds, which are actually more viable seeds. So that'll save you a few steps if you're getting into some fairly big seed lots, it'll cut down on the amount of labor. Otherwise, you probably could sort them by hand if you're only talking about several hundred seeds. Next slide, please. This is another example of a seed sorter, and it's just using a shop vac type system and some off-the-shelf plumbing to create another vacuum and gravimetric seed sorting system. Next slide, please. This is just another view, a side view of how that system works. Next slide, please. So we're at the very end. So what we've been involved with and what our vision has always been is for collecting seeds, propagating them, being able to put them back out into either plantations or into the field, and ultimately continuing with making baskets and allowing our basket makers to have a supply of materials for making baskets. Next slide, please. So hopefully this has been an inspiration. These are some photos of seed collection activities over the years, over the decades, I guess I could put it that way. Next slide, please. These are some references for some of the equipment that I showed in the slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now go on. Thank you very much. And then I have one last note. I just wanted to mention that there's an upcoming gene conservation. I don't think you have that on there. So anyways, I can pass that URL in the chat, and there is a gene conservation symposium that's going to be held in August. I think it's August 12th to 15th in Ottawa, Ontario. It's primarily, the primary topic is genetics, so make sure you get that information for those that might be interested in attending. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Les. All right, we have a little bit more time for questions. Again, if people want to, I know we've been firing questions and answers in the chat. You can continue putting questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
I have a question. I just wondered, how do you determine if a seed is viable or not?
Can I answer that question, or I think there's a lady with the seed bank was on earlier? Well,
You answer it.
there's a couple things that you could do. One of the quickest ways is if you have access to x-rays, to have the seeds x-rayed. They would tell you if there's any weevil holes in it. So that's one way. Another way is actually through sorting. If you do the gravimetric and vacuum sorting, it'll definitely differentiate between the viable and non-viable seeds. The other one is, I mean, if you want to test seeds, you can get them tested, and it'll do a viability test where they actually look at germination rate. So there's different levels of testing. Some are pretty straightforward and simple to do on your own, and it really depends on the amount of seeds you're handling.
Another way that we kind of do it low tech in the field is cutting open one seed from a tree and seeing whether there's a white fruit body in there. Typically, if it's super dried and brown looking, it's not viable. So you're looking for that kind of white fruiting body.
How quickly should you move from seed collection to drying? What's the kind of optimal time that you maintain viability in that between those stages?
Probably before you get too far along. I would say that if you're going to be propagating them, it's probably not going to be, I mean, if you've collected them and you plan on planting them fairly soon, usually what they'll do is they'll plant them in large lots, and then if they get a large germination rate, they can usually split them up or thin them out. So what grows, and what doesn't, won't. And then once they have to thin the seed lots, they usually plant them fairly densely and then start sorting them out. Same thing with pots. They would probably maybe put 4 or 5 seeds into a pot, and some will germinate, some will not. And if there's too many in a pot, then they'll just split them off.
We had a question in the chat. How does treatment against EAB with insecticides impact seed viability? Should trees that have been treated be excluded from seed collection?
From what's been shared with me, there's no indication that it has any impact.
I'll just ask a follow-up. I think Ella mentioned how it was important to collect seed from trees that are infested. If I caught that correctly, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's just keeping in mind that those trees that are infested with EAB are likely going to not be alive in a few years. So making sure that there's collections of that genetic stock is especially important. Yeah. Also, yeah, especially trees that are surviving longer and are infested with EAB, those trees might have genetic traits that make them linger a little bit longer than other trees. So we want to make sure that we collect those seeds as well.
All right, well, I think we're going to shift to breakout groups. I saw some back and forth in the chat. If folks want a copy of the chat, you can shoot me an email and I can send it over to you. So we'll transition to breakout groups. We're going to be for about 20, 25 minutes. You're going to be randomly assigned into a group with one of our speakers. So you might be in a group with Les, with Emily, Ella, or Tyler. And then we also have another speaker, another breakout group leader, John Daigle, who has volunteered to help. He is a professor at UMaine and leads the Ash Protection Collaboration Across Wabankik lab. So we're very lucky to have all of this expertise here to guide our breakout groups. In the groups, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to be kind of working with your breakout group leader to go through a seed collection cycle. We have activity sheets that we've created. The activity sheets were developed based on the Brown Ash Seed Collection Manual. So just another shout out to Emily Francis, who's on the call, who put that together. This is based off of her work. So it'll be my turn to mess around with technology and we'll see how that goes. What I'm going to put in the chat here is a link to a Google Doc that it's the same form, it's the same activity sheet, but for each of your breakout groups. So each group is going to have their own form they're going to work through. I encourage you to export a copy of the sheet. If you want to take it home with you, you could also email me after. I'm happy to share copies of the activity sheets. All right, so I'm going to do my best to move everyone to breakouts. I'm going to
perspective. That's been really valuable as a collaborator. Different land trust organizations working with us, both in trying to pull together seed collection kits, but also identifying sites for doing some of this collection. So folks were thinking along the same lines there. In areas heavily impacted by ash or emerald ash borer, ash removal is starting to occur. And so kind of a double-edged sword, trees are dying, but also those are sites where people know there are ash trees. And so maybe trees that were left behind might be producing seed. So a group to reach out to, those that are removing ash. On Vermont state lands, there's some brown ash demonstration sites for management and integrated pest management that might be great for seed collection. We got I don't know what that acronym is in Vermont, but they're licensed to collect on all state-owned lands, across demonstration forests and in different wildlife management areas, urban and community forestry staff, helping with ash ID on state lands. So folks are looking across the state of Vermont for these sites, and those folks are all great to reach out to. I added that I have a site that I do some rabbit hunting, and I've found brown ash, and I'm going to go back to that site to see if it's producing seed. But reaching out to folks who are recreating, whether it be hunting, fishing, or whatever it be, those folks might be able to get us information on sites. And actually, the Scarborough Land Trust has examples of signs that the Land Trust put up to try to connect with that group. Christina Fitzpatrick was with the Wabanaki Public Health, and they talked about some of their efforts to assess ash stands on tribal land and working with traditional knowledge holders in that capacity, both because of basketry, but also other medicines, other foods grow in these forests. And that group is really valuable for the breadth of knowledge that they can bring, but also identifying these sites. And then Southern Maine and Alfred, there's the Massabesic Experimental Forest that folks are going to reach out to. I've been out there. There are definitely lots of wet areas, so maybe there's some brown ash growing. Then we went through and we talked a little bit about the process of collecting, some of the things we want to look for. And when we made it to preferred methods for collection, we did talk a little bit briefly about seed years being sometimes 9 years apart. A way to stay fresh on your skills can be to collect from a non-ash species, or green ash because it produces every year. Or you can just practice. You can go out with a big shot or go out with your pole pruners just to stay fresh and ready when we do get a big seed year. And hopefully this year is one. And that's about where we made it before we ran out of time.
Great, thank you. I want to be mindful of folks. I know we're at time, so if people need to drop off, we understand. But I think we'll still go through each of the groups for those that want to stay and listen. Emily, do you want to share some outcomes from your group?
Sure, yeah. I'll be pretty brief. I'm in a pretty quiet group. Sounds like a lot of folks in our group haven't done any ash collecting yet or found sites to collect on yet. So they're really in the beginning stages of kind of going through the manual and figuring out what the first steps are with identifying sites and trying to get the process actually started and going, which I think is a lot of people's kind of stuck point is where to start. So I shared some information about where I generally find new stands and things like that. A lot of times for us, it's somebody wants to do an educational program on ash, so we reach out to APCAW, or we have a land trust reach out to us saying they found ash, and then we connect them with whoever is best to connect them with. Usually it's somebody from APCAW, and then we try to do some joint collections if possible. So really what I think I got out of this was that folks are in the very beginning stages, but excited and interested in what to do and how to do it. So yeah, we kind of went through the basic steps. And I encourage everyone to look through the manual if they're really feeling excited about going and finding ash seed and plan ahead about what they're planning on doing with the seed, because the last thing we want is wasted seed. We want it to go somewhere that's either going to grow it or use it or store it. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. John?
Yeah, and just to add, not to be repetitive, I think some of the same things that Tyler and Emily talked about came up in our group. But what was clear was a short amount of time to get through all of the steps in terms of planning for seed collection. And I guess what was clear to me, with the group was the variety of experience that's represented in our, in the group, with people having experience with seed collection, others that may be just starting a seed collection training program, and maybe how we might be able to learn from each other and stay connected, I think is something that at least something that I took away. We spent a lot of time in the first part in terms of thinking about prioritization and thinking about seed collection with different species of ash. We talked about things presented today about black ash and the mast years and being prepared for those. And also thinking about locations where you're collecting seed. And again, we were seeing different strategies in different states with how they're prioritizing seed collection, from watersheds to, ecotypes that we're thinking about in Maine. So there's differences there. And we also talked about the importance of consideration of seed collection over multiple years to really not only think about the geographic regions, but also multiple years to try to capture that genetic diversity in those same regions, being important as part of our plan, if the goals is to try to capture that genetic diversity. Let's see. Yeah, the other thing in terms of thinking about efforts around seed collection is the idea of, well, you might not have a mast year or seed production for brown ash, but maybe you could have seed collection with other species that I think can be helpful for kind of the training of potential seed collectors. And when you have brown ash that is available and you have a mast year, people will be trained and ready to collect from brown ash. So still have those where you might have green ash seeding or white ash, and because those can be really valuable training sessions for people who are interested in seed collection. And finally, when can we predict that mast year? And again, that's so hard, but someone else mentioned, well, get out there early in the year, see what seed might be producing, because it's so hard to predict those mast years. But you can get a clue, by kind of monitoring your forest stands. And I think I'll stop there to let the other groups share.
Thanks, John, for those are very practical suggestions. Les?
I'm here. That was interesting discussion. And the first thing that I would comment, we had a great group and a very diverse group. And the group actually represented a very large geographic region, extended beyond what I had envisioned this group to be at the outset. And I'm very glad that we had the representation there. We didn't get as far as we would have liked to, but that's only because we had some good discussion on a number of things. We talked about the criteria. I put cultural because that's what I've been involved with, just to kick things off, get the groups started to talk. But one thing that came up that I haven't given a lot of thought to, and I really appreciate having it come up, is insect diversity. We talked about a lot of the elements that are associated with ash, and its physical component, its hydrological component. And we talk about the diversity of other plants and animals, but insect is so important too, and they play a very important role. So I think that's a very good discussion point that came up. And definitely, there's the overall need for preserving diversity, whether it's forest diversity, and also for trying to target some areas that are going to be impacted by EAB. And selection, a few things came out for sites. Couple things that came out of that was, depending on how the land is based, whether it's agency or public, you really have to think hard about accessibility and maybe getting some of those barriers taken care of before you go onto the sites and getting out to the public. And that would help with outreach and awareness and elevating the concerns about ash. Let's see. So the other one is selection. We talked about that. Scouting and identification. Most everyone is really good with identification, I think, with this group, so they're good with that. We talked a little bit about the sex determination in the trees, and I think it's an important thing to talk about because of the broad geographic range with which ash, black ash in particular, exists in. And it's another component of black ash that's not fully appreciated, but it's important to think about when you're collecting ash, black ash seeds. across the range, because you're going to run into different expressions in the flowering. Talked about cycles and some of those for planting. Probably April, May would be identified as the best time to start looking at maybe the flowering. But then we did talk about the cycles too, and that came up in some of the other previous groups, is the cyclical pattern of brown ash in particular, and how important that is. And it just points to the importance of, and if these trees aren't seeding every year, and it's only 7 years, and then you get an infestation and that site is wiped out in maybe 2 to 3 years, it's going to have a really, really devastating impact. Techniques, I think, is where we kind of finished off on. I think the most important element that came out of that is sizing things up to help plan for the equipment you're going to need, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of where a couple questions came up, and I thought they were good questions, and maybe it's something that we can reinforce maybe as a group, and getting information out to people is, I think we really need to zero in on what we mean about drying seeds, and to make sure that they're not subjected to heat. It's a different process. I think people think about some of these dryers and they add heat to them. We want to make sure we're not adding heat to anything, and just air dry them and dry them down with some sort of desiccant. Great group. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Les. Last but certainly not least, Ella, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I'll try to go pretty fast. We had a great group too. We had folks all from across the region, Vermont, a lot of people from Massachusetts, someone who's even connected to the town Ashland and didn't know if there was ash in Ashland, but I thought that was pretty cool. We had folks from New York too, and Maine. In terms of prioritizing criteria, we had someone who's connected to basket makers share a little bit more about basket quality trees. And he said he's heard trees with a straight stem and no knots are the best, and a site without cedar, because that can make the splints pretty brittle, and flowing groundwater. Then we also had a question about lingering ash. So what trees could be considered lingering? And this is on the monitoring and managing ash site, but 7 or more years where EAB has been in a stand and you're still seeing a healthy tree could potentially be a lingering ash tree. And that's a high priority to collect from. And then we had a few sites in Massachusetts people want to collect from. And we talked a little bit about working with conservation groups who already maybe have it a part of their job to go out and look for more sites. Like Emily said, we're really at a lot of folks in our group are really at the beginning of just finding sites. And then we also had people have some questions about the difference between white and green, or green and white and brown, and emphasize the importance of the petiole. Especially in early seedlings when the compound leaves emerge, you want to look for the existence or the non-existence of a petiole to tell green ash from brown ash and white ash from brown ash as well. But a lot of people said, even some of the foresters in the room were saying that it's difficult to tell green from white. And someone pointed out that they look for the fine hairs on the stems of ash, on the mid veins of green ash, as opposed to white ash. So that's a tip that I'd only heard a few other times, so that was really helpful. And that's about as far as we got. So thanks everybody for coming out and listening and participating. This was great.
Great. Thank you, Ella. Big thanks to our speakers and breakout group facilitators. We couldn't do it without you all. So thank you for your time. And for those of you that hung in here all the way to the end, I'm going to send out a recording of the meeting and a copy of the chat, and a survey come your way about the event. Thank you all. We hope to see you at future SAP-Ne events. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.